All right, so we've actually been building up to this particular section of the lectures for a couple weeks now, because by now having a good understanding of the visual system and the motor system and the somatosensory system, we now have the background we need to apply that knowledge in the context of restoring the senses. And there's actually been work that has been done on most of the domains of sensory processing. We're going to focus primarily on sensory restoration in these two domains. I should say, though, that to give a quick shout out, though, that when we talk about audition and auditory processing, we'll talk about sensory restoration and cochlear implants there. A little bit been done about taste and smell, not nearly as much, though. So for this particular unit, what we will do is focus on these two senses. And specifically, what we're going to do is focus on different aspects of them. And when we're talking about movement and touch, we're going to focus specifically on brain-computer interfaces or brain-machine interfaces. Either they're the same thing. And then when we talk about vision, though, we're going to actually talk about two different types of ways of sensory restoration: BCI, brain-computer interface, and gene therapy, which we talked about a little bit on the second week when we talked about optogenetics, but we're going to actually even make it a little more fun this time. All right, so when talking about movement and touch, we're going to ask two questions. First, can we restore motor movements in artificial limbs? And then second, can we restore a sense of touch to those limbs? Now, there's been a long history of prosthetics in, the last 150, 200, 300 years. I actually don't know how far back they go. This is, I believe what is referred to as a peg leg, dating way back. And sometimes these devices, these prostheses can get pretty elaborate. Sometimes there have been these pulley systems where, you can actually have an artificial limb that can open and close at will. Actually, one of my friends growing up in high school, his name was Alex. He was born with like his arm cut off on his left arm right underneath his elbow. And so he had a prosthetic and he could press certain buttons on it that would open and close so he could, grab things, hold on to things, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing about these prosthetic limbs that is actually kind of interesting is that they will work way better when the patient has a phantom limb to rely on. And now, for some of you, you probably know what I mean when I talk about a phantom limb, but for those of you who don't, a phantom limb refers to this phenomenon where when a person loses a limb, they will still have the feeling that that limb is still present. So actually about 80 to 95% of people who lose a limb, a hand, an arm, or whatever, will have the false experience that that limb is still there. And now when I say the false experience, what I want you to kind of imagine is like if you close your eyes, you know that your hand is still there. So like right now, if you look in the corner and look at me, my eyes are closed. I can't see my hands, but I can touch my fingertips just fine. I can take two fingers and touch them just fine because I have proprioception. And so because of that proprioception, I have a general sense of my body still. So people who have phantom limbs will basically report that they'll have that experience, whereas even if, say, your arm is missing from, the elbow or something, people without that limb will still report that they're like, this is odd. I feel as if it is still there. I feel as if I still have my hand there. I still have this sort of proprioceptive feeling and sense that it is still there. Now, the thing about phantom limbs, though, that is particularly interesting is that sometimes they can be very distorted. So sometimes they are relatively normal, like a normal limb would be. So here with this particular person, you can see the arm is kind of at a decently understandable type of position, or with this guy's leg down here, something as well. But sometimes they're very distorted where people will say things like, oh, it's odd, right around my elbow, my hand juts out. It's not like I have a forearm, or my leg actually is bent at a 90-degree angle. If you'll look down at the corner for me for a second, I actually, when I was at MIT at one point, I had a student who got in a really bad accident and she lost her left arm at her shoulder. That's where they had to end up doing the amputation because of the accident she was in. And her phantom limb was just jutting out directly like 90 degrees to the side. And it was interesting because sometimes I would like kind of watch her and I would notice that when, for example, when she would go through the door, even though she could like have, the door go right by her, she would always kind of turn her body in this way as if she was walking through the door with this arm outstretched. And I once asked her about it and she's like, I know it's silly. And like, I can do it, but I just kind of prefer not to. It just sort of is like a natural instinct to try to avoid the thing that's there. One time I had a student in the class and we were talking about this and she was really open about her phantom limb. And he just kind of like went over and like waved his arm through her phantom limb. And you could just kind of see on her face that she was like, please don't do that. I know rationally that it's fine, but it's just kind of a creepy sensation. But another thing about phantom limbs is, in addition to being distorted, is that unfortunately sometimes they can be super painful, and that actually people will report that they're having a pain in their phantom limb. And it's very, very hard to treat because the pain isn't actually obviously coming from the limb itself. There's no limb there. It's coming from maladaptive neuroplasticity. When the brain's trying to rewire itself, which is what's giving you the impression of the phantom limb altogether, sometimes the rewiring doesn't go right and people will be in pain. Here is actually a little video kind of summarizing a lot of what I was just saying, but it has some great graphics and descriptions. I do have to apologize in advance. This man who made this video is a little over the top and dramatic, but I still think it's a good video and worth watching, but he's a little cartoonish, as you'll see in a second.
Phantom limb! 95% of people who have lost a limb will continue to feel sensation from the limb. This is called phantom limb syndrome.
The sensations can last for a few days or for several years. People even continue to feel familiar details from the limb, like wedding rings or watches.
The limb can feel very realistic or distorted in shape and size.
Numbing the stump doesn't get rid of the sensation, which tells us the sensation is not in the body, it's in the brain. Sensory input goes to your somatosensory cortex and is separated by body part. When you lose a limb, the corresponding neurons in the brain stop firing. But neurons have a trait called neuroplasticity, which promotes the formation of new connections. The inactive brain cells attempt to take on the function of the neighboring regions.
But this remapping is not perfect, and the brain still interprets the firing of these neurons as signals from the missing limb. Phantom limb is a side effect of the brain attempting to repurpose its neurons, or maladaptive neuroplasticity.
But neuroplasticity can help a pained phantom limb if we use a mirror to send the brain fake sensory information from the limb to the visual system.
With repeated use, the somatosensory cortex will rewire into a pain-free phantom. Phantom limb illustrates the power of neuroplasticity.
Okay, so like I was saying, a little over the top. So basically what happens is that you will have an individual who has, let's say, a typical sensory and motor cortex, and you can see these maps like we talked about a couple weeks ago for the feet, the trunk, the hands, the fingers. But then if they lose their limb or lose their hand in this particular case, eventually what will happen is that over time, the face will kind of take over that respective area, and that'll kind of creep up into there. And so that obviously the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex will stop representing the fingers and the hand if the hand is no longer there. But this process, especially in older adults, can take quite a while. Sometimes actually it doesn't even fully happen altogether. Sometimes actually there's always lingering tissue related to the hand and the fingers. And it's that sort of lingering it's that sort of like lingering tissue or that reorganization process that gives both the experience of the phantom limb and gives the experience of the phantom pain sometimes. And so back to the thing that I was saying when I first started talking about phantom pain and phantom limbs is this idea that prosthetic limbs work better when the patient has a phantom limb to rely on. The reason for that is because, for example, if a person has, let's say, a prosthetic leg, so let's check these out. If you have a prosthetic leg, but you have a phantom that kind of matches that prosthetic, so like you can get your phantom limb and the prostheses to be kind of congruous with one another, amputees feel much more comfortable using those. They feel more dexterous with them because their proprioception of their mindset, their proprioception sense from their mind matches their sense from their body. And so they're able to use it much better. Sometimes actually people will even make kind of odd requests with their artificial limbs to match their phantom limb, even if their phantom limb isn't quite right. So they might, ask to remove one of the fingers or change the shape of the foot or something, because it actually turns out that if you get that limb to come forward in your head from the phantom, you can actually end up using those prostheses a little bit better. What we're going to talk about now is different ways in which we can have an artificial limb that we can move with our minds, okay? Now, there's a couple ways that this can be done. The first is what is called a muscle-based artificial limb, okay? So what's going on with this guy here is he has all these different sensors on different parts of his arm, okay? So what you'll notice is in a second when I start this video, you're gonna see that those muscles in his bicep and his triceps are gonna be flexing. And those sensors are linked into this artificial arm that is connected and literally drilled into his, I don't know what the bone is for the upper part of your arm. I know your femur is in your leg, but I don't know what this one's called. Tibia, fibia, is that in your leg? Those are in your legs, not important. And so actually what these sensors are doing are processing the muscle activity underneath and then transmitting signals to this artificial limb that is causing it to move. And it actually works really quite well. So let me show you what this looks like.
To sit here and curl 45-pound dumbbell all day long till the battery runs dead. So a soldier like him with them big old guns, I can sit here and match him. Even though my arm is cut off here, the nerve endings that would have went down here to work with the hand, they've been taken and reinverted into different muscles into the stump. When you think about something, the brain, when it sends it down the nerve, it's a minute electrical charge. It comes down wherever the nerve ending ends, well then the myobands here will pick up that jiggle. With where it's at, you know, the myoband signaling the signal down to the computer in the arm, and by doing that, then it lets the arm know just exactly what I want it to do.
You can imagine some of our service members, they come back serving their country with tremendous injuries, and we say, can we repay the debt back to them by developing technologies that give them a better quality of life? And a great example of that is, if you're living, let's say you lost the limb in service of the country, could we give you a prosthetic arm that it gives you near natural control, very much like your own arm?
Okay, so in this case, this patient, this man with the limb, he mentioned something that might have been a little confusing to people, which was he mentioned this thing about the nerves being kind of like rerouted, okay? So what's going on there? So that rerouting is actually what allowed him to be able to open and close his hand, okay? Because I bet some people were wondering, wait, I understand the notion of like you flex your bicep, the limb comes forward, but how do you get it such that in this part of your arm, your biceps and triceps, you can open and close the limb, okay? So here's the way that works. You have a wire going from, say, your motor cortex, okay, that runs down your spine, through your arm, into your hand, that causes your hand to open and close, okay? You have a literal wire that's doing that. Now let's imagine, though, that you have lost your limb. What you can do is you can say, like, hey, that wire that would have gone into my hand to open and close my hand, forget that. Let's not have it go to my hand, because I don't have a hand. Let's have it go to this part of my bicep. Okay, now the part of the wire that would be involved in closing the hand, let's have it go to that part of the bicep. So what's going to happen then is when a person thinks about opening their hand, the signal will come out of their brain just like it would. It'll go down the wire that's involved in opening your hand, except now it won't actually open your hand because it's innervating with part of your bicep. And then when you think about closing your hand, the signal will start in your brain, it'll go down your spine, it'll go into your arm, but instead of closing your hand, it'll flex a different part of your muscle. And so the way that these scientists can actually do this is that they literally do this sort of rewiring in your person, in your body, to actually innervate in the muscles that are already there. So here is a little kind of schematic showing how this works. So you have your patient, and what you'll do is you'll attach the nerve endings, which would have run down to the hand, to, in this case, the chest muscle. In a second, I'm going to show you a patient of a man who doesn't have any arms whatsoever, okay? So what this means is that when this patient imagines moving his missing limb, the electronic pulses from his brain will cause his chest muscles to contract, because these red wires that normally would have gone down the arm, they're not going down the arm anymore. They're now innervating with his pec muscle. So then you have electrodes on his skin that pick up the pulses in his chest, sends the signal to the computer, which translate them into motorized control in the false arm, into the hand, and in finger movements, okay? And this is like what you just saw. Those electrodes that were on in the last patient, that were on the bicep and the tricep, are going to be sending the signals. In this case, though, this is much more extreme, what I'm about to show you, because this is a man who has no arms whatsoever.
Tell me if you feel any kind of sensation, first of all, anywhere in your phantom limbs. Like if you feel it like on the side of your arm here, or elbow, or pinky, like tingling, any sensation at all.
Tingling.
Underneath this area you're getting.
Yeah, there's something that's going on there.
What the procedure of targeted muscle reinnervation does is take those free nerve endings that formerly controlled the hand, wrist, and elbow and shoulder, and moves them to remaining muscle groups that are still there. When your brain thinks open the hand, it then fires the end point of that nerve and contracts that muscle, and we pick that up and can map it to the missing limb.
I believe that's right down the bird finger.
You're flipping me the bird right now?
I think so. think you found the magic point.
I found the magic spot. We should put a big star on that one.
Bingo. We can go home now.
Okay. Mission accomplished.
Oops, sorry.
These limbs, they are mind controlled. Closed. So you just think open, and now.
By the way, the sensors now are these little electrodes right there. So these are the electrodes that are picking up activity from his chest muscles, and they're the ones that are controlling the limb.
Is the shoulder up? Or the shoulder back?
Shoulder extend, ready, and go. All right. Shoulder flex, ready, and go. Okay. We're going to bring it into your body, ready, and go. There it is.
You got the picture in mind how you want everything to be, so it just takes a while to achieve that.
It's okay.
And when it don't move quite right, you just start pushing yourself. You want it so bad, but yet it's still out of reach.
There it is.
So it works pretty well, but notice what he was referencing just there, kind of his frustration, and that sometimes the things that he'll be thinking, it still won't work very well, because when you're just measuring activity of some muscles, it's pretty coarse, it's pretty crude, okay? It's not very precise. And doing something like, for example, opening a bottle cap and then holding it, oh God, and then dropping it, oh darn. I don't know where it went. Oh geez. You know what? We're going to find it later. Oh, I think it went in my shoe. It did not go in my shoe. I have no idea where it is. It doesn't matter. All those fine motor skills for something like that, it's hard to translate the complex pattern of activity that is required to do that from activity on your muscles. So instead of doing that alone, what researchers have also worked on is this idea about training a computer to decode the pattern of neural activity itself from the source in the brain rather than the muscle, and then translate that decoded neural activity into a motor action with that artificial limb. So let's first start about what do I mean by training a computer to decode activity. What I mean is actually the same type of thing that we've talked about before with something like pattern analysis when it came to vision. So for example, we asked this question a while back, can we decode what you just saw from brain activity? And we talked about how you could do that. We talked about this in the context of something like, what was it? Faces in houses, where you have a situation where here's what faces look like, here's what houses look like. Hey, here's a question, what am I looking at here? And in this case, you understand, oh, I've trained an algorithm that recognizes that this is a picture of a face, okay? So it's that same sort of type of process that we've talked about, where you can have a situation where you train an algorithm on like, hey, this is what your pattern looks like when you're looking at a shoe. This is what a pattern of activity looks like in your brain when you're looking at a cat. Here's a new pattern of activity. What do you think the person was looking at? And in this case, you can train an algorithm pretty easily to be like, oh, that's a picture of a different type of shoe, okay? So that's in the context of vision, but what you can do is that same type of neural decoding, not with just things like faces and houses and stuff like that, but you can do this with motor commands and motor activity. And this sort of process of just learn what a pattern of activity is serves as the foundation of brain-computer interface, brain-machine interface, and so on and so forth, okay? So part of the reason we spent so much time talking about that in vision is because now we can apply it to this new domain here. And so really what goes on in this particular situation is you'll actually do a direct recording of the brain, not through some sort of indirect method like fMRI, but through actual human electrophysiology. And so in this case, what you'll do is you'll try to decode patterns of activity, not from the ventral visual pathway, obviously, but from primary motor cortex actually in the brain. And so when I say that it's, human electrophysiology, I mean, you're literally sticking electrodes into a human brain. This thing right here is like the, adapter that you plug into the computer or something else. And so what ends up happening is you have these tiny little arrays, which are very small. This is showing you what a dime looks like for scale. And those get implanted directly into the cortical tissue. and then you close the, the incisions up, so it's a, a closed circuit. And then what you can do is have a person who can just function with these electrodes that are permanently implanted in their motor system, and they're on the top of the head again, because that's where primary motor cortex is. And in this particular case, I know that this is a patient, he is permanently intubated. He has a tracheotomy to help him breathe because his paralysis was so severe below the head that actually he'd sometimes have problems even breathing from manipulating and moving his own diaphragm. So here's kind of a schematic about how you go from patterns of activity in the brain to actual movement. So you have your implanted microelectrode arrays, and they're going to be sending the signals from those neurons to some sort of instrumentation and analysis neurochip, basically a computer. And so what ends up happening is you have some transmission of neural activity. They're basically measuring action potentials. So each of these rows are neurons. Each of these cells are just action potentials firing. And what ends up happening is now this is the pattern of activity that you're going to train the classifier to recognize. Okay, the classifier is going to be watching this activity come in real time, and rather than decoding, is it a face or is it a house? It's going to be decoding a three-dimensional movement trajectory. And what I mean is like the way that your arm is going to move in 3D space to grab the bottle. Okay, and so there'll be some analysis that'll be done from the computer algorithm to compute this trajectory in XYZ space. And then once that trajectory gets computed, it will actually create this real-time interface to control the prosthetic arm to try to go and reach the ball. So in this case, the pattern of activity got computed to be the sort of downward into the left trajectory. That downward into the left trajectory will be implemented in the robot arm. And then as the person sees what their robotic limb is doing, that will cause them to think different thoughts, and thinking different thoughts will cause different patterns of neural activity. So it becomes this closed loop circuit. Here is just a little video, because sometimes this can be a little tricky. So here's just the video to drive it home.
It's possible for people to use their thoughts to control devices, either a computer or a robotic arm. And the way that happens is that we implant a tiny sensor, just about the size of a baby aspirin, just into the surface of the brain, and that sensor pick up the electrical impulses from a bunch of neurons. And each of those little neurons are like radio broadcast towers putting out impulses. And when they get to the outside, a computer translator converts the pattern of pulses into something that is a command.
For the record, I was just literally on my hands and knees looking for that darn bottle cap. And I feel like it fell into another nexus of existence because I can't find it anywhere. All right, I'm gonna have to learn to let that go. All right, so I showed you a video at the very beginning of class of a monkey manipulating a robotic limb to get the, what was that? Marshmallow. Here's another video of a monkey doing something like that just to drive it home. In this case, what the monkey is doing is it's getting a juice reward that's like a little straw. It gets a juice reward when the hand grabs this orange block. And so you can see it's watching very intently. Let's see if I can succeed in doing it. Sucking on it. These two inputs here, these wires are actually the ones that are going into the monkey's brain. So this is a monkey that's obviously not paralyzed. It can move. It's just in this particular case been restrained while you're doing the experiment. Okay, so now let's see a video of this in an actual human. And so in this case, this is the robotic limb that is being controlled. And then the task that this woman's going to try to do is, as these little kind of purple ball things raise up, she's going to try to reach out with her robotic arm and grab them.
We're able to control a prosthetic or a robotic arm simply by thinking about the movement of their own paralyzed hand. And they did that using the investigational brain-gate neural interface system. So they thought about using their own arm and hand as though they were reaching out themselves with their own limb, and the robotic arm moved much the way their own arm would have moved.
Okay, so that is the technology that's used to develop our artificial sense of movement. A question then is, can you close that circuit even more and use a similar technological approach to restore the sense of touch? Okay, so now this isn't about giving you sensory restoration in terms of movement, but about actual somatosensation. And the way this works is, like I said, closing the loop. So before, what we talked about is how you go from neural activity and motor cortex, M1, where you record the neural signals, decode the motor intent, and then have a robotic arm move. what you can do is then you can outfit those robotic limbs with touch sensors in them. Like you can just literally build hardware that can process pressure, temperature, and things like that. And then the sensors that are in those limbs will send signals, outputs from the arm, which will get converted into stimulus pulses, and then you can electrically stimulate somatosensory cortex. In the same way that, remember all the way back in week 2 when we talked about electrical stimulation when we were talking about the face patches, it's the same idea, where you just take a bunch of electrodes like this, implant these in somatosensory cortex now, rather than motor cortex, and now you'll deliver electrical pulses from these electrodes into somatosensory cortex while you're measuring electrical responses from the neurons in motor cortex. And the reason that this works so well, like we've talked about, is the fact that somatosensory cortex is really differentiated between different parts of really fine motor systems. So, all these somatosensory systems. So D5, 4, 3, 2, 1 corresponds to the different fingers. You can, put electrodes in the wrist and the palm and all these different things. And so what you can do is you can just basically put the electrodes on this whole grid of activity here, or this whole grid of cortical tissue here. And by stimulating different parts of it, you can stimulate different artificial somatosensory experiences to restore the sense of touch. So let me show you some videos of what that looks like.
I lost my hand approximately 3 years ago in an industrial accident.
Igor Spedek of Madison, Ohio, has benefited from the mechanical motion of a prosthetic limb, but he hasn't been able to feel things in his grasp.
I have to visually look at whatever I'm picking up, watch that I don't over squeeze.
Over the last...
Okay, so first of all, I think it's kind of weird that CBS was adding insult to injury by calling it fail. Give the guy a break, he lost the limb. But the point that they're trying to make is that when you don't have a sense of touch, things like squeezing too hard become problematic. And so it's actually, I wish I could find these. I once saw this video when I was at MIT of this guy who studies somatosensation, and he showed this video of you put anesthesia in someone's 2 hands. No, sorry, not anesthesia. It is anesthesia, but it doesn't like make them droopy and dead. It just makes them numb. So you could still move them, but you just couldn't feel them. And then he showed a video of a person trying to do really basic things like tie their shoe, eat spaghetti, and all these different things when they couldn't touch anything. And it just turns out that without your touch sensors, you really become super duper duper clumsy. And that you might think that you're tying your shoe because you're watching it, or that you're opening the bottle because you're watching it. But it actually turns out that like so many of the different things that you're doing, I can kind of in a clumsy way manipulate, not really that well, but I can sort of manipulate this chopstick just by feeling it, even though I can't see it. And so it's this idea of, well, giving people artificial limbs is helpful, but it would be super helpful if you could give artificial limbs that could restore touch. So now I'm going to do is show you a video where they've taken one of these artificial limbs that you can move with your mind and given it these sensory capabilities.
Soft.
This guy here is blindfolded, so he can't see what he's touching.
Hot. Medium.
Okay, so in that case, his hand just had the capability from the electrodes in his brain to do soft, medium, hard. But like I was saying, you can get much more specific by taking advantage of the somatosensory cortex for the different parts of the hand. So let me show you what that looks like.
It's provided Igor with a sense of touch, and most recently, the ability to distinguish between textures.
Ridges on the middle finger.
In 19 distinct locations in his hand.
The palm. And sandpaper on the middle finger.
All right, so again, you can see that because of the sensors and the way that they outfitted this hand here, he not only has the capability of moving that hand, he can now feel different types of textures in that hand. Okay, so that's going to be it for movement and touch on brain-computer interface. Let's take one last break, and when we come back, we'll talk about sensory restoration with vision in terms of these sort of brain-computer interfaces, and then gene therapy. And that will be lecture 6 in this unit, and that'll be it for this particular section on action, touch, and restoration.